John, so I guess this is the motor. We were just talking about the window motors and the small window motor, and you said that that wasn't the one that the TUV people tested. So I guess this is the motor. Is this the motor that the TUV?
This is the TUV motor. This is the test that the German engineers tested and took back the batteries with them. This is the motor where Tom Bedini was standing there through the whole test. And it's quite an interesting story. When I first put this one motor together, I wanted to make a motor that you could, in other words, we had the monopoles all along. We had the Watson type motor, and we had this one that was under glass that we just viewed. And they didn't believe that it was actually charging the second battery while it was running.
So you're pulsing it with a small battery and charging the big battery.
Yeah, what's happening is this is a monopole motor. I can stop this. This is an all North Pole motor. I can show that by the indicator. You can see that the poles are not going to change. All right. Now, if you listen very closely, I'll try to get close to this. What you're going to hear is you're going to hear the oscillator come on, and then you're going to hear this slight, and that's when it dumps the charge to the battery. So here, listen. When it drops down like that, that's when the charge that's in these capacitors. So I don't want to confuse this motor with what's on the monopole groups or anything like that, because this is the capacitive discharge one. This is the Watson motor. This is how you would do the Watson motor with a capacitive discharge. But to do that, you have to have some kind of way to contact that, to run this solid state switch here that's in this block of plastic. And then that charge is dumped to this battery. Now, if you notice, this is a 5 amp hour battery, and this is a 12 amp hour battery that I'm charging. So I'm like charging double capacity on the battery. So they didn't believe me, and they hired BTI, which was Bedini Technology. They hired TUV because they thought that the German firm would be much more reputable than the American firm, which would have been UL.
Yeah, and TUV is a big...
TUV is a big testing laboratory of all kinds of things in Germany: cars, motors, boats, engines.
Industry standard.
Yeah, industry standard. So Gary hired TUV at about $35,000. And then we also hired Tom Bedini to come out and present the theory. And Tom says, I don't need anything. I'm just going to do it, right? So away came Tom Bedini. And I said, well, Tom, if you come out here, I'll just buy you that digital scope that you want. And he came out, and we bought him the scope. And what happened was that they made us construct a Faraday cage, a complete copper Faraday cage, which was contained everything in this Faraday cage. And after extensive research on the bench top, actually made Gary scrape off the paint on the bench top because they wanted to make sure there were no hidden wires. After filming and taking photographs of underneath the bench, and then moving the bench to different places, right? Thinking that John hid some pancake coil or something in the cement and this was going to keep this thing going. Well, we wanted to run out the string, And what I mean by run out the string was, we wanted to start with a fresh battery and 5 discharge batteries, which shows up in the report. And I think at the end, all the batteries were right up, you know, very close to what I started with. And it was kind of unique because every night the TUV engineer would lock this in a lock box, the whole thing. He would take all the pieces and lock them in a box, and they had a TUV van. They had a van that Gary got for him, actually had to take him from the airport. And then that van was locked up in the bay next door, and nobody had the keys to the bay next door. And then the very following morning, when everybody was there, we would walk to the van, we would get this out, we would put it back in the Faraday cage, and the test would start over again. And of course, Tom always looked at him kind of funny, you know, like, come on, you know, this guy doesn't cheat. I mean, he just builds this stuff, and there it is, right? But after about 4 or 5 days, and about 35 to close to 40,000, I think, with meals and everything, he left with his report. He had an analyzer that showed the power being put into the motor, and then what was being discharged into those batteries that were dead. Now he took the batteries, he left one of the little batteries charged, and he took the other 4 others or 5 others, and he took a quartz bulb, a 500-watt quartz bulb, and he took them right to 0. In other words, he didn't goof around with it. He took these poor batteries. I mean, they just went right to 0, you know. And then after it was at 0, he disconnected the quartz bulb and let him sit for a half hour, and then he connected the quartz bulb back up because he drained every bit of energy out of these second batteries. And he then proceeded with the test. He started with 1 battery, and then all of a sudden, Tom Bedini was always sitting in the chair smiling, you know, because he knew what was going to happen with this machine, right? And he said, I said to him, I says, well, look, Tom, they're almost at 14.5 volts. It's time to stop this test. You know, and the TUV engineer said, no. And then what was remaining in this battery, because this motor quits at 9 volts. So we had it set to quit at 9 volts. So when the battery got down to 9 volts, the test was over. If you didn't charge all those batteries by the time this got to 9 volts, which is like, you know, nothing, right? And so when this one was at 9 volts, the test stopped. He took that battery, hooked the quartz light on that battery, and brought it to 0, right? Mm-hmm. And then he took one of the batteries from the string and put it over here, right? Meanwhile, putting the 0 battery with the string, and it went like that until he depleted all the batteries, because what they were trying to figure out was how much energy is this thing actually, you know, putting out, and what are we getting out of all these batteries? Well, at the end of the test, he said, I never seen anything like this. He says, this looks really good. He says, all I need to do is just take 2 of the batteries back with me, and you know, we'll write the report, because this is a very favorable report that, you know, that this can be done now with energy systems where you can pulse this and run mechanical energy, right, like blow the fan, which it's doing right here if you put your hand here. and meanwhile conserving every bit of energy that's coming out of this machine back into this battery. All right, and so Gary drove him to the airport, returned the van. The lockbox went back to the person that he rented it from, right?
Yeah.
By the way, the TUV guy is the only guy that ever had the key. Nobody else had the key to this lockbox. So what happened after that is Gary and him talked on the way to the airport. The guy says, "I've never seen anything like that." He said, this is something that's like on the forefront, you know, of technology. That means we can run fans, we can run boats and things like that and conserve every bit of energy and still have a battery to get back, right? So he got back to Germany to TUV, and no report came. A month went by. And then a couple of months went by, you know, and nothing came. So Gary called, and Jay called, and everybody else tried to call, right? And the guy told Gary on the phone from over there in Germany, says, "We can't issue the report. We would never give out a report like that." Meanwhile, they just took $35,000 to $40,000 of our money because they were paid to do the test. You know, nobody was around this guy. I couldn't do anything, and I was sort of stuck. And I do, if we can cut for a minute. Okay, so anyway, I was into wearing hats at the time, so I'm sorry. I had a big Ford on my head here, and I was explaining the inventor. And here's the TUV motor. So you can see that in the pictures, there is the German engineer. There he is. And you can see all the equipment that he has here and all the paperwork that he's working with. Of course, I'm standing there, Gary's standing there, and Frank Hensel's standing there. And if you look on the bench, you can see all the equipment that he brought with him here. And by the way, you'll notice that there's another motor he's testing at the same time in here, and that's the one that's right here.
Okay. Okay.
So,
What year was this you did the testing?
2000.
2000, that's right.
Okay, so we had Hamilton Productions is shooting this whole thing on tape. You know, this is where he's making me drain these look at the size of this little battery here. Can you get a good shot of that? And he's making me drain these batteries with this quartz light. And notice the cage. Everything's grounded.
Okay.
Everything's inside the cage.
Like mosquito netting.
Yeah, I actually had to pick up the cage. They moved the cage, right? And
Yeah.
you can look in here. They wanted everything, and there's the scope reading what the battery is that's being recharged.
Yeah.
You see, it's already got it up there. The results. So there's the results. 13.3, not depleted yet, right? The worried look from the TUV scientist, right? So there he is marking the batteries. And notice that the window motor is also here. That's this one over here. And more results. So all these batteries now are at 13.3, right? Which the TUV engineers consider charged at 13.3. The discussion.
Is that you and Gary? And
That's Gary, myself, and Frank Hensel. That's David Hamilton. Notice what's in the background back there, the motor that ran all those years.
Right.
He wasn't allowed to test it. And the worried look after the test.
What was his name again?
Frank Hensel.
Frank Vincent.
So there you go, Tony.
So when you talked to him on the phone a couple of months after the test, was he kind of apologetic at all?
No.
Just
No,
typically
he was
very,
reti-
very
No, the thing was that he said that his boss would never allow him to write a report like that, and that we were wasting our time to try to ever bring anything out like this, and that he was retiring. He had a couple of weeks to go and he was retiring. Of which he said to me on the phone, he said, just personally between you and me, they won't let me write the report. Of course, I have no proof, so.
So what happened to the Hamilton film?
Oh, we have the Hamilton film.
Yeah.
We have the whole test of which Tom Bearden,
I have that film.
yes,
Okay.
and Tony did get the film.
Okay.
So,
So whatever he says about the report, the results are documented.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have 8 hours of TUV tests.
Yeah, they were all, and the batteries came right up. I mean,
Yeah.
this guy made me take them to zero.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I said, well, you're going to damage the lead acid cells if you pull them down that low. They're not. Oh, no. These are deep cycles. You know, they're little bitty 5-volt
Yeah.
lead acid cells at the, I think they
But
call
I
it.
could understand for testing purposes, they'd want to test them through distraction to see,
That's what they did.
yeah.
And when this thing brought him back all the way up, like it's doing this one right now, it's raising this one in increments,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you know, and not doing anything to this one.
Yeah.
You know, and then I get, since this is a capacitive discharge, based on Bearden's theory of the capacitive discharge, you can trade these two batteries.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
so
right.
you can trade them because
Right.
you're transforming the radiant energy of this machine into capacitive energy, which is the same thing that we talked about with the Tesla switch. And so now you can trade these two batteries.
Right.
So that's what TUV kept doing.
And that's what Watson was doing on a bigger scale.
Yes,
Because he used a capacitive.
yes, capacitive discharge.
Yeah.
With the groups, with the SG group, I knew that they wouldn't be able to get these cams right and the timing right and the contactors right, and so I put a diode, you know, back to the positive and then back up to the positive pole here, and it worked the same way, except that it wasn't capacitive discharge. But the two forms of energy are completely different. This machine is taking the radiant pulse and rectifying it and sending it to these capacitors over here. So if you put a neon light here, it'll light these capacitors with 90 volts of power. And then this is the electronic switch in here that works from these contacts. And then it dumps it, and that's what I wanted you to hear.
Yeah.
It start out.
Yeah. You could hear it. Ooh.
Yeah, right. And that's each time the dump occurs.
Right.
And if you look at this meter, the needle now is just a little bit above where we started at, and will continue to rise.
Yeah.
You know, but this takes a long time because we're only talking about minute little currents here, and we were talking about little batteries. That's a big battery. You know, this is 5 amp hours, and this one over here is 12 amp hours.
Yeah.
So now we can do the reverse. You know, we can say, okay, stop the motor, reverse the two, and let's start over again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we can watch this one raise up. You know, so it's not that we ever hit anything. This is in our patents. This is in our monopole patent. under capacitive discharge. But once again, Tony, I have to point out that Tom Bearden is responsible for this. You know, it's based upon his theory. I call it radiant. Tom Bearden calls it negative energy. Tesla called it radiant, so, you know, I'm calling it radiant energy.
Yeah.
So, that's what happened.
So how did you first get involved with the Bedinis?
I was introduced to the Bedini boys because their dad, Alex, was a patient of a friend of mine who was an oral surgeon. And the oral surgeon and I had been friends for a number of years, and so he called me one day and said, I want you to meet John and Gary Bedini. And he said they've got some audio technology that's very interesting. And I said, sure. So I met with Dr. Tom Walsh, and we went out to their shop on Dalton Gardens, which was the first place they moved to after they came up from Sylmar. And that's when I met John and Gary, and I listened to their spatial technology and put on the earphones and did the whole surround sound, and developed kind of the fondness for the boys, and I understood inventors. And so that led from the audio thing into their energy products. That was kind of on a step-by-step basis when they started disclosing some of John's inventions.
Yeah, and these were a sort of development from what he'd already been working on in Sylmar, a linear progression from, I guess.
Yeah, they brought it all with them when they came up, and so they just had actually come out of a kind of a negative situation. They got in the hands of some less than honorable people, and with a company called Gamma, and so they decided to, and I think the earthquake scared them away too. So, and Alex was up here and their family, so and Coeur d'Alene was a very nice place for them to live.
Yeah, Alex, didn't he own a restaurant as well, or was he involved?
Yeah, he and his wife operated a small Italian restaurant on 4th Street. It was a family-owned operation. It only had about 10 tables. It was always full. Alex did all the cooking, and his wife helped. And that was a fun place to go. It was a family place.
So, okay, so you got a whiff of what. How long did it take you to kind of sort of get what John was doing with regards to the energy?
Well, not long.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd been engaged in business with inventors before, so as soon as you express a little bit of interest, they're more than happy to show you what they have. And so I was open-minded and listened, and I was intrigued by John's technical expertise.
Yeah. You mentioned that there was, he put something in a drum and had it go around and as a demonstration for you, or in an oil drum, or?
Oh, that was early on. They decided they wanted to commercialize one of their products. And so they moved down onto a small facility on Celtice. And John had shown me some of these models and explained the switching circuitry and the magnetics. And so he said, well, we need some capital. And I said, that's understandable. You know, every company that's in a development stage and in new technology needs capital. And I said, well, show me what you can do with this technology, because I was a little bit skeptical, like a lot of people. So about a week later, I went back to their new facility, and he'd taken a welding torch and cut off the bottom of a 25-gallon barrel, and had mounted a shaft with bearings on either side, and then he had his magnetic motor and coils and had it wired up, and had 2 batteries. And so he started this motor, and it explained that it took a small amount of energy from the live battery to operate the system, and he was pulling energy off of the motor to charge the second battery. And he showed me it was absolutely dead. So there was one live and one dead battery, and he had a little LED measuring device. And when this battery started to get down to some level, he would simply switch it, then he'd use the battery that he charged, and they would charge back to this battery. So it went back and forth, and he ran it for 6 months, and finally he called me and he said, okay, I've run this for 6 months, and he said, the problem is my bearings are wearing out. Are you a believer? And I said, yeah, I'm a believer, John. So anyway, he clearly demonstrated to me, at least on a novice level, that this system that he'd put together, which it wasn't very sophisticated, but it was, obviously efficient. And he explained the issue about how a magnet does not give up its energy. You just have to know how to manage it. And so from that standpoint, I became a believer in John's energy. And then, of course, over a period of time, he explained more and more as the trust level went up. Then he would, throw out little pieces here. So it didn't take long to figure out that John was really a unique character and had technology that was had tremendous potential if it would get commercialized. It was a real game changer. So from that standpoint, I started to get involved with the company on a more intimate basis and provided them some capital and started working with them, developing a strategic business plan and just helping them from the business and marketing side.
And basically, you're basically a businessman slash financier. So that what you brought to the table was basically business expertise and financing, I guess.
Yeah, that was the role that I ultimately assumed, was to get involved from a financial consulting basis, because they were technically up to speed, but there were certain financing was not in their wheelhouse. I mean, they just they understood they needed money to grow, and so I provided them a blueprint and explained to them and educated to them what their options were to get capital, and more or less became their financial advisor.
Yeah, and this went on over what kind of period of time, would you say?
Well, at least going back 20 years, back through the last 3 or 4 years, I hadn't been particularly doing a lot of work for them because I had suggested a number of strategies, and it was clear that John and Gary's expertise was as inventors and technology development, but when it came to commercialization, that was just something that was off their radar. They would say, yes, let's go develop this particular technology or this product, and we'd start down that road, and it became very obvious that almost to the point that I thought that they really wanted to hold the technology and didn't want to let it out there. So if you have that attitude, it's very difficult to monetize the technology and come up with products that you can sell and self-finance the company.
Yeah, and underlying this was also probably a desire to altruistically benefit humanity to some degree, because this is clearly if it could be monetized and if it could be gotten out there, then it was clearly a very beneficial technology for the world in general, presumably.
Yeah, the boys were a little bit hard to figure out. I looked at it strictly from the standpoint of a business person and a financial person and how to move the company up to the next level. And I think, in retrospect, I think that kind of concerned them a little. They didn't want to deal with the idiosyncrasies of having potential shareholders and having all that minutia out there. They just were comfortable on the prototype bench and making gadgets, and they did have some small products, as you know. They had their battery rejuvenation system and their water lights, and they've always managed to be able to have enough products to sell to keep the lights on. And I'm sitting here saying, here's an option. If you take this project or this product and you do this, this, and this, here's the blueprint. Here's how you can take it to the next level. And that didn't seem to interest them particularly. I think they had this nice little cozy cocoon, and they liked to operate within that. And on the other hand, they didn't. They just weren't motivated to do a lot of commercial products. I had a hard time relating to that as a businessman, and so we had some, not differences of opinion, but different styles of the way that I could see the company going, and they just loved R&D. That's where their heart and soul was.
Yeah, and talking about the smaller things that they did, I believe you said that John built a toy for your daughter to take to school.
Well,
It was
yeah, that was interesting. When my daughter was in the 8th grade out at Meade Junior High, she had to come up with a science fair project. So logically, I'm sitting here saying, wait a minute, I got this tremendous resource over here called John Bedini, who's kind of a wizard with electronics. So we went over there, and John came up with a very small battery, and he could fabricate anything. If he could get an idea at midnight and come down to the shop, and by 8 o'clock the next morning he'd have a prototype. So John came up with a contraption. It wasn't really a contraption. It was a rotary motor that had the typical coil and had a small rheostat and a small battery. But what he did was he strung a whole series of LEDs in the area around the generator, and they were not wired, they were freestanding. All the LEDs were wired together in a loop, and so when you would turn the motor on, it would spin and it would create a force field around the motor, and he had figured out how to tap that. So if he would adjust it, and if the rotation of the toy, I would call it, was slow, then the LEDs would flicker. And then if he speeded it up, the whole thing would light up like a Christmas tree. And so when she took, we did a write-up, and she took it out to her science fair, and the 8th grade teacher had it, just was absolutely beside himself. He swore there was some trick. There was no wire to the LED loop. It was just sitting there freestanding, but it would light up. And he kept looking underneath the device and around it, and he was totally befuddled. And he said, you can't power lights like this if it's not connected. He just couldn't get his head around the fact that there was no connecting wire between the LED and the motor. She won first place. And I'm sure that to this day and age, he's probably still scratching his head. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And then, of course, she gave the motor back to John, and I think he gave it to one of his nieces or nephews, and they recycled it as another science fair project. But it certainly demonstrated how he could use one of his motors, and he could adjust the rotation, which created the energy field around it, and how he could tap into it.
Yeah. So in an effort to validate what John was actually doing, I mean, you'd seen this on the bench, and you'd heard the stories, and you'd looked at the amp meters and volt meters and so forth, but in order to take it to interest more investors and to validate the whole process, I think you were the impetus behind getting it more professionally tested. Well,
anytime you have a disruptive technology, and I think that's what John had, you need outside validation. So we first initially started with a professor at Gonzaga University, and we invited him over to take a look at it, and John went through his whole routine and explained it, and for some reason, I think the guy understood it, but when we asked him to write an independent report, he backed totally away from it. So then I said, well, John, we need to get really serious about this. And I said, I'll actually finance it. But I said, let's hire an independent analysis by TÜV, which is a testing group that's based in Germany, but they have offices here. So we tracked down TÜV, and I got on the phone and negotiated a fee. I think it started out as $5,000, and they would fly up one of their electrical engineers and they would do the testing. And as it turned out, this gentleman was in their San Diego office, and so we flew up, and I picked him up at the airport and hauled him over to Bedinis, and John spent most of the day with him, and we took him out to dinner at the Coeur d'Alene Hotel, and he was staying at the airport, so I bought him back after dinner, and he was skeptical at first, but he went through it, and I think John explained it and went through the circuitry and what happens, and by the time we were having dinner, it appeared that the light had really gone on, and this guy was understanding the cycling and the switching of the polarity of the motor, and how, in fact, John was able to pull the energy off and put it into a battery. And John made it very clear, this is not a perpetual motion machine. You need energy to use it. And as long as you have a storage device, there's a net energy gain. And most of his bench work would suggest that his system would generate 4 times the amount of energy that you put into it, possibly 5 under certain circumstances, depending upon the efficiency of the motor and technical things that I probably didn't understand.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was really encouraged, because I figured if TÜV came in and would write this report and were accurate about it, that would be the key to the vault, financially speaking, that we could go out and put together the additional capital and then commercialize it. So I was very hopeful that this, I can't remember Frank's last name, but
Hensel.
What's that?
Hensel, H.
You're right, Frank Hensel, yeah. So anyway, he and John had subsequent conversations. I don't think I spoke to Frank after that initial meeting. They wanted to get some examples of John's motor to ship down, and they could test it. And then John told me, John was intellectually a very honest guy. He didn't embellish things, and he had some strange attitudes, but I mean, he told it like it was. And Frank just basically called up and said, I can't, based on the information, I've submitted it to the office in Germany, and we can't put our name on this. And he didn't come right out and say it, but I think the implication was, if you sign this document, this report, you probably should start looking for another job. Something to that effect. Or I don't think it was a direct threat, but I just think that TÜV didn't want to have any part of this, any part of John's technology. So I'm not even sure, I can't remember, I'm not even sure they even ever issued a report, or they may have issued one that was very benign.
I asked Gary about it. He said that he got nothing.
He what?
He said he got nothing from TÜV.
Yeah, I think they just took our $5,000 and said, adios, guys. I think they just,
Yeah.
which was totally different than, when I dropped, and I picked up Frank the next morning and took him to the airport. He was very positive and said he was enlightened and he understood this, and this was a game changer, and he was, and Frank was a bright guy. I mean, you don't work for that entity unless you're highly qualified. And so when I put him on the plane, I thought, wow, this is going to be a major breakthrough for us, because now we have validation from somebody the world will pay attention to. They wouldn't write the report.
Yeah. Who who received the news that they wouldn't write the report? Was that John or Gary or you or?
No, they were in communication together, and I think Gary kept calling Frank, and they were apparently doing some testing and doing the the switching of the units and measuring the voltage, and I'm pretty sure that Gary got the information and just said that that they were not prepared to issue any kind of report. Yeah. And Gary said, well, we paid for a report. I'm surprised Gary didn't ask you to send the money back.
I was going to ask, did they ask for a refund?
Yeah, we didn't do that. So anyway, then I met with John and Gary, and I said, well, we did what we were supposed to do. That was the right path to prove the technology, but we picked the wrong person to validate it. And of course, John said, "Oh, I told you so. I knew they wouldn't do it." And I said, "Okay, John, you're right." So anyway, they continued to to develop different projects and different technology, and they went into the solar side. They were purely research. That was their area of interest, and when it came to commercializing something, or marketing or anything, it just wasn't a priority. So I tried to move them in certain directions and different strategies, from the toys to the joint venture with a German company, and they always made enough products to meet the payroll. Yeah. And once they did that, they were fine. And I was looking for something to take it to the next level, and they were happy being R&D and selling the water lamps and the battery rejuvenators, and we'll make 10 of these, and and that was just that was their comfort zone. So
yeah.
So the last 3 or 4 years, I had just got to the point where saying, well, I'm not going to move them out of this. That's where they live, and for me to try to come in here and take them to the next level is not going to happen. So I just stayed as a shareholder and stayed friends, but I had committed enough time, energy, and money that I said, "Uncle." So anyway.
And just hoping for the future that some seeds that they planted might still germinate, I guess.
Well, I still think it's a disruptive technology, and hopefully there's some people out there that are smart enough to have either interfaced with John before he passed, or can put together his notes or take his projects and reverse engineer them. Yeah, that'd be a nice legacy for John if somebody would pick up his technology and actually take it to the next level.
Yeah.
Hopefully there's some smart people out there that are intrigued enough that they'll try to pick it up and run with it.
Yeah. Do you have any questions, or do you have any questions?
No.
I think it was great.
Just tell it like it is.
No, I think that was fabulous. Yeah.
I'm happy if you're happy.
23 minutes on them. Yeah. Fabulous. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. That's.
Well, I hope it helps you.
Well, what's kind of interesting is that we've actually tracked down Frank.
Yeah.
He's in retirement.
Oh.
Yeah, and I haven't called him yet. I don't know whether he's under an NDA or some kind of.
You know what my recommendation is?
What?
You read body language. You're an old pro. You need to not let him answer you on the telephone.
I know.
You need to make an effort to go one-on-one with him.
Yeah.
And at this point, I think he'll still sidestep it.
Yeah, you never know. I mean.
That's been a long time ago. I'm sure he still remembers it.
Oh yeah.
I would say, hey, how about if I just buy you lunch?
Yeah.
I'm not even sure I'd tell him it's about Bedini. He might just say, oh, there's an area I don't want to go into. Because I think he really I think he felt bad that he didn't deliver.
Yeah, I'm sure he does, you know, yeah. Yeah. It's pretty hard to come up with an excuse about why I'm cruising around and bump into him. You know, I have to think that one through.
So I wonder how old he must be in our age. I think he might even have been a couple years older than me.
I don't know.
I don't know.
He's probably early 70s. I think we figured out 72.
Just a young fellow.
Yeah, just a kid.
Just a kid.
He's still alive.
Well,
Because I got a private investigator onto it. They went down to the DMV and got his driving license photo, and I said, yeah, that's the guy. So.
I don't know. I didn't get to know him well enough to be able to give you any insight as far as how he might reflect that.
Yeah.
He might just say, "Oh, that was just bullshit and a total fraud." And, you know, I don't know.
No, because I have old Hamilton's film of the test, so you can't say the test didn't work. You know.
You might approach him and just say, "I'd like to show you this film and see if you remember it."
Yeah.
Just I've always been. You can tell him I was a friend of John Bedini's, and I know he did some testing, and just I have a piece of film I'd just like to have you look at and see if what you recall about it.
Yeah.
I would just low key it.
Yeah. No, I've been.
I'd be really curious to find out what he said.
I'll let you know.
In 2018,
Frank, is there anything you'd like to say on camera in the last 5 minutes of the tape? Get you the dub as soon as possible.
An interesting time.
Okay.
Thank you everybody for the inputs. And yeah, now I have to put everything together.
Okie-doke.
I'm going to take 2 batteries, one which we charged yesterday and one which we charged today, to completely drain them and determine the amount of charge as accurate as possible. And yeah, this will be in addition giving us some data which we need. Yeah, and hopefully at a certain point in time we can have the big machine run.
Very good.
And charging back and forth car batteries.
Okie-doke. With that, I'm going to stop the tape. Concludes our test. Okay. Good deal. Thanks. Yeah. Very good.